September 14th, 1973. Dennis Poor walked into the Triumph factory at Meriden for the first time in his life. He read a statement, then he walked out, got into his car and drove back to London. He did not answer a single question. Behind him, 1,700 people had just lost their jobs. What Poor didn't know, what he couldn't have known, or perhaps didn't care to, was that at that very moment, Triumph dealers across America were reporting something extraordinary. Sales were coming back. Demand was rising. After years of struggle, the Bonneville was selling again. He killed it on the best day it had seen in years. At its peak, Meriden built 140 motorcycles a day. Triumph owned half the American superbike market. The Bonneville wasn't just a motorcycle, it was the motorcycle. Steve McQueen rode one. A generation of young men on both sides of the Atlantic built their identity around one. Then, a financier from London read a piece of paper, refused to answer questions, and drove away. What happened next has never been repeated in British industrial history. The workers locked the gates from the inside, and they didn't leave for 18 months. How does a group of welders, machinists and assemblers take on a corporation, a government, and an entire collapsing industry and somehow win? And why, in the end, did winning not be enough? The Honda CB750 did not kill Triumph overnight. Industries rarely collapse that cleanly. What it did was something more insidious. It exposed every decision that Triumph and its parent company BSA had failed to make over the previous decade, and it gave those failures a deadline. BSA Group had owned Triumph Engineering since 1951. On paper, the arrangement made sense. Two of Britain's most respected motorcycle manufacturers operating under one roof, sharing costs, combining resources. In practice, it produced something closer to paralysis. BSA's board was populated largely by men whose backgrounds were in finance and general industry, not in motorcycles. They understood balance sheets. They did not understand why American riders were beginning to choose a Japanese machine over the Bonneville, and they did not particularly want to understand. The American market would sort itself out. It always had. It would not sort itself out. Through the late 1960s, Japanese manufacturers were not merely selling motorcycles. They were redefining what a motorcycle was expected to be. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki and Suzuki invested heavily in modern production facilities, overhead camshaft engines, and electric starting as standard equipment. Their quality control was meticulous, their reliability was exceptional, and crucially, their prices were competitive despite shipping costs across the Pacific. This was not dumping, as British manufacturers would later claim. It was simply better manufacturing discipline, applied consistently, at scale. Triumph's engineers knew what was needed. They had been saying so for years. New tooling, updated engine architecture, electric starting, improved quality control, none of it was beyond Triumph's capability. All of it required investment that BSA Group was unwilling to commit. The money that should have gone into Meriden's production lines went instead into a lavish new design and research centre at Umberslade Hall, a country house outside Birmingham, staffed with young engineers brought in from the car industry, tasked with designing the future of British motorcycling. The future they designed very nearly destroyed it. In 1971, Triumph introduced the oil-in-frame Bonneville, a redesigned machine with the engine oil carried inside the frame tubes rather than in a separate tank, intended to lower the centre of gravity and modernize the chassis. It was a sound engineering concept. The execution was catastrophic. The new frame was too tall, making it impossible for most riders to place both feet flat on the ground. Worse, it was discovered at the start of production that the Bonneville engine would not fit into the new frame without first removing the rocker boxes. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was an assembly line stoppage.
Meriden missed the American sales season entirely. In a business that ran on the rhythm of model year launches, missing the American sales season was not an embarrassment, it was a financial wound. BSA Group's share price collapsed. The losses from 1972 alone exceeded $16 million. A company that had once claimed to build one in every 4 motorcycles sold worldwide was suddenly staring at insolvency. The response from government was swift, if imperfect. The Conservative administration of Edward Heath decided that the British motorcycle industry was too strategically important and too significant as an exporter to be allowed to fail. In early 1973, the Department of Trade and Industry provided £4.8 million to finance a rescue. The condition attached to that money was non-negotiable. BSA Triumph would merge with Norton Villiers, the only other significant British motorcycle manufacturer still standing.
The resulting company would be called Norton Villiers Triumph, NVT, and it would be placed under the control of Dennis Poor. Poor was, by any measure, an interesting man. He had raced cars at the highest level in the early 1950s, finishing fourth at the British Grand Prix in 1952. He had founded the motorsport journal Autosport. He had built manganese bronze holdings from a marine propeller business into a diversified engineering conglomerate. He was intelligent, decisive, and accustomed to getting results. What he was not, and had never been, was a motorcycle man. He did not ride. He did not have a sentimental attachment to any of the brands now under his control. He looked at Norton Villiers Triumph the way a surgeon looks at a patient on the table, as a problem to be solved with the least possible delay. The problem, as Poor saw it, was straightforward. And MVT had 4 factories: BSA's site at Small Heath in Birmingham, Triumph's Meriden plant, Norton's assembly facility at Andover, and the Wolverhampton works that manufactured engines and components. 4 factories producing overlapping products for a shrinking market was not a business. It was an expensive way to go bankrupt more slowly. Rationalization was essential. 2 factories would have to close. Poor looked at the map, he looked at the numbers, and he made his choice. Meriden was the newest factory. It had been purpose-built. It was, by any objective measure, the most modern and efficient motorcycle manufacturing site in Britain, but it sat on land that had become valuable as the West Midlands expanded. Its workforce was the highest paid in the group, and its product, the Bonneville Twin, was, in Poor's assessment, a machine with no long-term future in a world moving towards larger, more sophisticated motorcycles. He decided to close it. He would announce the decision in person. He would make the trip to Meriden exactly once. That visit was scheduled for the morning of 14 September 1973. The workers at Meriden went in that day, not knowing what was coming. The Jew was still on the car park when the first shift arrived. The line started. The machines ran. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary morning. It would be the last one. Through the late 1960s, Japanese manufacturers were not merely selling motorcycles. They were redefining what a motorcycle was expected to be. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki invested heavily in modern production facilities, overhead camshaft engines, and electric starting as standard equipment. Their quality control was meticulous, their reliability was exceptional, and crucially, their prices were competitive despite shipping costs across the Pacific. This was not dumping, as British manufacturers would later claim. It was simply better manufacturing discipline, applied consistently at scale. Triumph's engineers knew what was needed. They had been saying so for years. New tooling, updated engine architecture, electric starting, improved quality control. None of it was beyond Triumph's capability. All of it required investment that BSA Group was unwilling to commit. A Honda CB750 did not kill Triumph overnight. Industries rarely collapsed that cleanly. What it did was something more insidious. It exposed every decision that Triumph and its parent company BSA had failed to make over the previous decade, and it gave those failures a deadline. BSA Group had owned Triumph Engineering since 1951. On paper, the arrangement made sense. 2 of Britain's most respected motorcycle manufacturers operating under one roof, sharing costs, combining resources. In practice, it produced something closer to paralysis. BSA's board was populated largely by men whose backgrounds were in finance and general industry, not in motorcycles. They understood balance sheets. They did not understand why American riders were beginning to choose a Japanese machine over the Bonneville, and they did not particularly want to understand. The American market would sort itself out. It always had. It would not sort itself out. Through the late 1960s, Japanese manufacturers were not merely selling motorcycles, they were redefining what a motorcycle was expected to be. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki invested heavily in modern production facilities, overhead camshaft engines, and electric starting as standard equipment. Their quality control was meticulous, their reliability was exceptional, and crucially, their prices were competitive despite shipping costs across the Pacific. This was not dumping, as British manufacturers would later claim. It was simply better manufacturing discipline, applied consistently, at scale. Triumph's engineers knew what was needed. They had been saying so for years. New tooling, updated engine architecture, electric starting, improved quality control. None of it was beyond Triumph's. The money that should have gone into Meriden's production lines went instead into a lavish new design and research centre at Umberslade Hall, a country house outside Birmingham, staffed with young engineers brought in from the car industry, tasked with designing the future of British motorcycling. The future they designed very nearly destroyed it. In 1971, Triumph introduced the oil-in frame Bonneville, a redesigned machine with the engine oil carried inside the frame tubes rather than in a separate tank intended to lower the center of gravity and modernize the chassis. It was a sound engineering concept. The execution was catastrophic. The new frame was too tall, making it impossible for most riders to place both feet flat on the ground. Worse, it was discovered at the start of production that the Bonneville engine would not fit into the new frame without first removing the rocker boxes. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was an assembly line stoppage. Meriden missed the American sales season entirely. In a business that ran on the rhythm of model year launches, missing the American sales season was not an embarrassment. It was a financial wound. BSA Group's share price collapsed. The losses from 1972 alone exceeded $16 million. A company that had once claimed to build 1 in every 4 motorcycles sold worldwide was suddenly staring at insolvency. The response from government was swift, if imperfect. The Conservative administration of Edward Heath decided that the British motorcycle industry was too strategically important and too significant as an exporter to be allowed to fail. In early 1973, the Department of Trade and Industry provided £4.8 million to finance a rescue. The condition attached to that money was non-negotiable. BSA Triumph would merge with Norton Villiers, the only other significant British motorcycle manufacturer still standing. The resulting company would be called Norton Villiers Triumph, NVT, and it would be placed under the control of Dennis Poor. Poor was, by any measure, an interesting man. He had raced cars at the highest level in the early 1950s, finishing 4th at the British Grand Prix in 1952. He had founded the motorsport journal Autosport. He had built Manganese Bronze Holdings from a marine propeller business into a diversified engineering conglomerate. He was intelligent, decisive, and accustomed to getting results. What he was not, and had never been, was a motorcycle man. He did not ride. He did not have a sentimental attachment to any of the brands now under his control. He looked at Norton Villiers Triumph the way a surgeon looks at a patient on the table, as a problem to be solved with the least possible delay. The problem, as Poor saw it, was straightforward. NVT had 4 factories: BSA's site at Small Heath in Birmingham, Triumph's Meriden plant, Norton's assembly facility at Andover, and the Wolverhampton works that manufactured engines and components. 4 factories producing overlapping products for a shrinking market was not a business. It was an expensive way to go bankrupt more slowly. Rationalization was essential. 2 factories would have to close. Poor looked at the map. He looked at the numbers, and he made a choice. Meriden was the newest factory. It had been purpose-built. It was, by any objective measure, the most modern and efficient motorcycle manufacturing site in Britain. but it sat on land that had become valuable as the West Midlands expanded. Its workforce was the highest paid in the group, and its product, the Bonneville Twin, was, in Paul's assessment, a machine with no long-term future in a world moving towards larger, more sophisticated motorcycles. He decided to close it. He would announce the decision in person. He would make the trip to Meriden exactly once. That visit was scheduled for the morning of 14 September 1973. The workers at Meriden went in that day, not knowing what was coming. The dew was still on the car park when the first shift arrived. The line started. The machines ran. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary morning. It would be the last one. He arrived without ceremony. No advance notice to the shop floor. No all-hands announcement, no tour of the production line. Dennis Poor's car pulled into the Meriden car park on the morning of 14 September 1973, and the man himself walked directly into a meeting room with the factory's senior union representatives. He had flown in from London. He intended to fly back the same day. The meeting was brief. Poor informed the stewards that the Meriden factory would close in stages. Production of the three-cylinder Trident would transfer to BSA's Small Heath site in Birmingham. Production of the Bonneville Twin, the machine that had made Triumph's name, the machine that had conquered the American market, the machine that every person in that building had dedicated years of their working life to building, would be discontinued entirely. The 1,700 people employed at Meriden would lose their jobs. The timeline would be managed. There was nothing further to discuss. He then declined to answer questions, citing an urgent meeting in London, and left. For the union stewards in that room, the shock was not merely the decision, it was the manner of it. Poor had never visited Meriden before. He had owned the factory, through the various corporate structures that had assembled NVT, for months. He had not once walked the production line, spoken to a foreman, or sat in the canteen. He had come for the first and last time to deliver a death sentence, and he had done it in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. Outside the meeting room, the factory was still running. The line was still moving. Workers who had not been summoned to hear Paul's announcement were still at their stations, building motorcycles, unaware that the motorcycles they were building were among the last that would ever be made at Meriden. They found out the way the rest of Coventry found out. The midday edition of the Coventry Telegraph was on sale at the factory gates before Paul's car had cleared the site. The headline was unambiguous: Triumph Meriden to close. Workers coming off the morning shift bought a copy and read their futures in black and white, standing in the car park of the factory that had employed their families for a generation. What happened next was not planned. There was no pre-arranged signal, no prepared strategy, no playbook. It was simply that a group of men and women, skilled workers who had given years to this place, who had fathers and brothers and sons working alongside them, who could see with complete clarity what the closure of Meriden would mean for their community, decided, collectively and without hesitation, that they were not going to accept it. They closed the gates from the inside. By the end of that afternoon, Meriden was under worker occupation. Pickets of around 80 people rotated through shifts at every entrance around the clock, preventing any management attempt to remove tooling, components, or finished machines from the site. The occupation was orderly, determined, and absolute. NVT's management would not be returning to collect their property anytime soon. What made the occupation immediately remarkable, and what gave it a legitimacy that a conventional strike could not have provided, was the condition of the market at precisely that moment. While Poor had been constructing his rationalization plan, something unexpected had been happening in the showrooms. Triumph dealers across the United States were reporting a resurgence. After the difficult years of the early 1970s, American riders were coming back to the Bonneville. Orders were building. The waiting lists that had been empty were filling again. Meriden was being shut down at the exact moment its product was becoming commercially viable again. The workers knew this, their union representatives knew this, they articulated it clearly in the days that followed, and it became the moral foundation of everything that came after. Triumph was not being closed because it was failing, it was being closed because a man in London had looked at a spreadsheet and decided that rationalization was tidier than success. The market disagreed, and so did 1,700 people in the West Midlands. The occupation settled into a rhythm, families brought food, wives and children appeared at the gates. The wider trade union movement offered support, financial contributions, solidarity statements, practical assistance. The Transport and General Workers Union, led locally by Secretary Bill Lapworth, coordinated the workers' position and began exploring what had previously seemed an impossible idea, that the workforce might not merely save their jobs, but take ownership of the factory entirely. The concept of a workers' cooperative was not new in theory. In practice, in British manufacturing in 1973, it was virtually without precedent at this scale. Bill Lapworth and Dennis Johnson, chairman of the cooperative committee, began drafting proposals. A young fine welder named John Rosamond, elected to represent his fellow welders, found himself drawn into the center of negotiations that would consume the next decade of his life. From America, something unexpected arrived. Steve McQueen, whose image, astride a Triumph in The Great Escape, had done as much as any advertisement to define the motorcycle's appeal to a generation of young men, was reported to have expressed support for the occupation. Whether he visited in person, as some accounts suggest, remains unconfirmed. But the symbolism was not lost on anyone. The most famous Triumph rider in the world was not indifferent to what was happening at Meriden. Meanwhile, NVT's management pursued every available legal avenue to end the occupation and recover the site. None of them worked. The workers had the gates, they had the machines, and, critically, they had time. In February 1974, a general election returned Harold Wilson's Labour government to power. Among its ministers was Anthony Wedgwood Benn, appointed Secretary of State for Industry, a man who believed with genuine conviction that workers' cooperatives were not merely a romantic notion, but a viable economic model. The political landscape had changed. Port's certainty that Meriden would be closed, stripped and forgotten had collided with something he had not anticipated. 1,700 people who simply refused to go. The occupation continued, the gates held, and somewhere in Westminster, Tony Benn was already making phone calls. A Honda CB750 did not kill Triumph overnight. Industries rarely collapse that cleanly. What it did was something more insidious. It exposed every decision that Triumph and its parent company BSA had failed to make over the previous decade, and it gave those failures a deadline. BSA Group had owned Triumph Engineering since 1951. On paper, the arrangement made sense. Two of Britain's most respected motorcycle manufacturers operating under one roof, sharing costs, combining resources. In practice, it produced something closer to paralysis. BSA's board was populated largely by men whose backgrounds were in finance and general industry, not in motorcycles. They understood balance sheets. They did not understand why American riders were beginning to choose a Japanese machine over the Bonneville, and they did not particularly want to understand. The American market would sort itself out. It always had. It would not sort itself out. Through the late 1960s, Japanese manufacturers were not merely selling motorcycles, they were redefining what a motorcycle was expected to be. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki invested heavily in modern production facilities, overhead camshaft engines, and electric starting as standard equipment. Their quality control was meticulous, their reliability was exceptional, and crucially, their prices were competitive despite shipping costs across the Pacific. This was not dumping, as British manufacturers would later claim. It was simply better manufacturing discipline, applied consistently, at scale. Triumph's engineers knew what was needed. They had been saying so for years. New tooling, updated engine architecture, electric starting, improved quality control. None of it was beyond Triumph's. The money that should have gone into Meriden's production lines went instead into a lavish new design and research centre at Umberslade Hall, a country house outside Birmingham, staffed with young engineers brought in from the car industry, tasked with designing the future of British motorcycling. The future they designed very nearly destroyed it. In 1971, Triumph introduced the oil-in frame Bonneville, a redesigned machine with the engine oil carried inside the frame tubes rather than in a separate tank, intended to lower the centre of gravity and modernize the chassis. It was a sound engineering concept. The execution was catastrophic. The new frame was too tall, making it impossible for most riders to place both feet flat on the ground. Worse, it was discovered at the start of production that the Bonneville engine would not fit into the new frame without first removing the rocker boxes. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was an assembly line stoppage. Meriden missed the American sales season entirely. In a business that ran on the rhythm of model year launches, missing the American sales season was not an embarrassment. It was a financial wound. BSA Group's share price collapsed. The losses from 1972 alone exceeded $16 million. A company that had once claimed to build 1 in every 4 motorcycles sold worldwide was suddenly staring at insolvency. The response from government was swift, if imperfect. The Conservative administration of Edward Heath decided that the British motorcycle industry was too strategically important and too significant as an exporter to be allowed to fail. In early 1973, the Department of Trade and Industry provided £4.8 million to finance a rescue. The condition attached to that money was non-negotiable. BSA Triumph would merge with Norton Villiers, the only other significant Kentish motorcycle manufacturer still standing. The resulting company would be called Norton Villiers Triumph, NVT, and it would be placed under the control of Dennis Poor. Poor was, by any measure, an interesting man. He had raced cars at the highest level in the early 1950s, finishing 4th at the British Grand Prix in 1952. He had founded the motorsport journal Autosport. He had built Manganese Bronze Holdings from a marine propeller business into a diversified engineering conglomerate. He was intelligent, decisive, and accustomed to getting results. What he was not, and had never been, was a motorcycle man. He did not ride. He did not have a sentimental attachment to any of the brands now under his control. He looked at Norton Villiers Triumph the way a surgeon looks at a patient on the table, as a problem to be solved with the least possible delay. The problem, as Poor saw it, was straightforward. NVT had 4 factories: BSA's site at Small Heath in Birmingham, Triumph's Meriden plant, Norton's assembly facility at Andover, and the Wolverhampton works that manufactured engines and components. 4 factories producing overlapping products for a shrinking market was not a business. It was an expensive way to go bankrupt more slowly. Rationalization was essential. 2 factories would have to close. Poor looked at the map. He looked at the numbers, and he made a choice. Meriden was the newest factory. It had been purpose-built. It was, by any objective measure, the most modern and efficient motorcycle manufacturing site in Britain, but it sat on land that had become valuable as the West Midlands expanded. Its workforce was the highest paid in the group, and its product, the Bonneville Twin, was, in Poor's assessment, a machine with no long-term future in a world moving towards larger, more sophisticated motorcycles. He decided to close it. He would announce the decision in person. He would make the trip to Meriden exactly once. That visit was scheduled for the morning of 14 September 1973. The workers at Meriden went in that day, not knowing what was coming. The dew was still on the car park when the first shift arrived. The line started. The machines ran. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary morning. It would be the last one. The winter of 1973 into 1974 was not a comfortable time to be occupying a factory in the English Midlands. The oil crisis had sent energy prices soaring across the Western world. Edward Heath's government had imposed a 3-day working week to conserve electricity. Britain felt, to many of its inhabitants, like a country coming apart at the seams. Inflation rising, industry struggling, the lights literally going out on schedule. In that context, the sight of workers maintaining a round-the-clock vigil at the gates of a motorcycle factory in Warwickshire might have seemed like one more piece of evidence that nothing was working anymore. It was, in fact, evidence of the opposite. The occupation at Meriden was not a protest in the conventional sense. It was not a picket line of men standing in the cold with placards, waiting for someone in an office to change their mind. It was a functioning community, organized with a discipline and purposefulness that surprised everyone who observed it, and quietly humiliated the management that had assumed it would collapse within weeks. The workers maintained the factory in full operational condition. Machinery was serviced, the production line was kept ready, a skeleton crew continued to assemble motorcycles from the components already on site, not in large numbers, but enough to demonstrate the central argument of the occupation, that these people knew how to build Triumphs, that they were building them right now, and that the only thing stopping full production was the decision of one man in London who had never spent a day on a factory floor in his life. Shifts at the gates rotated through the day and night. 80 workers at a time, organized into watches, ensured that no vehicle entered or left the site without their knowledge and consent. The physical maintenance of the occupation fell to younger men, many of them like John Rosamond in their 20s, men who had come to Meriden as apprentices, who had learned their trades alongside their fathers, and who had not yet accumulated the mortgages and family obligations that might have made sustained resistance feel impossible. They stayed because they believed they were right. They stayed because they could not imagine doing anything else. The families of Meriden sustained them. Wives organized food rotas. Children were brought to the gates after school. The wider community of the village and the broader working-class neighbourhoods of Coventry and Birmingham, from which the workforce was drawn, provided a steady flow of practical support. This was not charity. It was solidarity in the most literal sense. People who understood instinctively that what was happening at Meriden was not simply about motorcycles. It was about whether a corporation could walk into a community, read a statement and walk away, and whether that community was obliged to accept it. The answer being assembled at the gates, one rotating shift at a time, was no. Politically, the occupation existed in an environment that was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Dennis Poor had made his calculations under a conservative government disposed to see industrial rationalization as economic necessity. In February 1974, that government fell. Harold Wilson's Labour Party returned to power in a hung parliament and then consolidated its position in a second election in October. The political arithmetic had changed, and with it the attitude of the state towards what was happening in Meriden. Tony Benn was the critical figure. As Secretary of State for Industry, he brought to his office a genuine ideological commitment to industrial democracy, the belief that workers had not merely the right to resist the closure of their workplaces, but the capacity to own and manage them. His cabinet colleagues were for the most part sceptical. His civil servants were more sceptical still. The Treasury viewed the prospect of government money flowing to a workers' cooperative with barely concealed horror. Benn argued, cajoled and manoeuvred through 18 months of internal government resistance to keep the Meriden proposal alive. The negotiations were long, complex, and frequently close to collapse. NVT's position shifted repeatedly. Poor, having initially expressed enthusiasm for the cooperative concept in public, proved considerably less cooperative in private. The question of what the workers would actually own, the factory, the tooling, the Triumph name, the distribution network, was contested at every stage. The American distribution rights, which controlled access to Triumph's most important market, remained with NVT, a structural weakness that would haunt the cooperative for the rest of its existence. There were moments when the whole enterprise seemed finished. Funding proposals were rejected by the Industrial Development Advisory Board. Cabinet ministers argued openly that the money would be wasted. The workers at Meriden, reading the reports that filtered through to the factory, tightened their grip on the gates and waited. In March 1975, Tony Benn came to Meriden in person. More than 400 workers, wives and children crowded into the factory canteen. The same canteen where 18 months earlier, men had stood reading the Coventry Telegraph in disbelief.
Benn stood before them and told them that the government would provide a grant of £750,000 and a loan of £4.2 million to establish the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative as a legal entity. The workers would own the factory. They would manage it themselves. They would build Bonnevelles. The noise that filled the canteen in that moment, part relief, part triumph, part the sheer release of 18 months of sustained collective will, was, by every account of those who were present, something that no one who heard it ever forgot. The gates opened. The line restarted. The Bonnevelle was back. But the terms on which the cooperative had been established contained the seeds of everything that would follow. The loan was substantial, the grant was modest, and the structural compromises forced by the long negotiations, particularly the loss of direct control over American distribution, had handed NVT a lever that could be pulled at any time.
The cooperative was viable, it was not secure. Joel Rosamond returned to his welding station. Dennis Johnson took his seat on the cooperative committee. Bill Lapworth went back to representing workers who were now, in a very real sense, representing themselves. They had won the fight they had set out to win. The fight that was coming was different in kind, and they did not yet know its shape. Meriden Motorcycles Limited opened for business in March 1975 as something Britain's industrial landscape had never quite seen before. Not a nationalised company, not a conventional private firm, not a charity kept alive by sentiment, but a factory owned and governed by the people who worked in it, making decisions by consensus, electing their own leadership from the shop floor, and staking their livelihoods on the proposition that they could succeed where the corporation had said success was impossible. The structure was deliberately, almost aggressively democratic. Every position of authority within the cooperative was subject to election by the membership. There was no imported management tier, no outside directors brought in to provide adult supervision, no hierarchy imposed from above. The workers had spent 18 months arguing that they were capable of running this factory. Now they were required to prove it. What they built in those first months was genuinely impressive. Production restarted with a workforce that had been reduced from the pre-occupation figure of nearly 2,000 to around 600. The reduction was painful but unavoidable. The cooperative's capitalization could not sustain a full pre-closure headcount, and the priority was establishing financial stability before expanding. Despite this, the atmosphere inside the factory was, by every contemporary account, transformed. Absenteeism, a persistent problem during the BSA Triumph years, fell sharply. Productivity per worker rose. People who had previously clocked in and clocked out were now arriving early, staying late, and arguing about production decisions in the canteen with the intensity of shareholders at an annual general meeting. Because that, in the most direct sense, was what they were. The waiting list of people wanting to work at Meriden exceeded 1,300 names. In a city with no shortage of employment options, people were willing to accept wages below the Coventry average in order to work in a factory they collectively owned. This was not naivety, it was a considered judgment about what made work worth doing. The Bonneville they resumed building was the T140, the 750cc version introduced in 1973 and developed through the occupation period with components assembled from existing stock. It was not a radically new machine. The cooperative did not have the capital for radical. What it had was an exceptionally well-built version of a motorcycle that the market still wanted, assembled by people with an unusual personal investment in getting every detail right. The American market responded. By 1977, the cooperative had found its rhythm. The Silver Jubilee Bonneville, a limited edition T140J produced to mark the Queen's Silver Jubilee, sold out immediately. Dealers who had written off Triumphs during the occupation years were placing orders again. The following year brought the result that silenced, at least temporarily, everyone who had said the cooperative was doomed. In 1978, the Triumph Bonneville was the best-selling European motorcycle in the United States. Read that again. Not the best-selling British motorcycle. The best-selling European motorcycle. In the world's most important motorcycle market, the product of a workers' cooperative in a Warwickshire village was outselling everything that BMW, Ducati, and the remnants of the British industry could offer. This was not luck. It was a consequence of a workforce building motorcycles with a precision and consistency that had not always been present during the BSA years, combined with a product that, despite its age, despite its pushrods, despite its absence of electric starting until 1980, possessed a character and a sound and a riding experience that Japanese motorcycles of the era simply could not replicate. The Bonneville vibrated. It leaked the occasional drop of oil. It demanded a degree of mechanical sympathy from its rider, and riders loved it for exactly those reasons. In the same way that certain people will always choose a difficult instrument over an easy one because the difficulty is inseparable from the reward. The cooperative was not merely surviving, it was winning. And yet the terms on which it was winning contained a warning that was easy to overlook in the flush of commercial success. The American distribution network, the infrastructure through which every Bonneville reached the dealer showrooms that accounted for the majority of Triumph's revenue, was not owned by the cooperative. It had remained with NVT through the settlement negotiations, and after NVT's liquidation in 1977, had passed to successor arrangements that the cooperative did not control. This meant that the cooperative's access to its most important market was always mediated by structures outside its ownership, and its pricing in that market was subject to forces it could not fully manage. The factory itself presented a similar structural problem. Meriden had been built as Britain's most modern purpose-built motorcycle facility in the early 1940s. By the mid-1970s, much of its tooling and many of its production machines were approaching the end of their useful lives. Replacement required capital, capital required borrowing, borrowing required collateral. And here, the cooperative encountered a wall that no amount of commercial success could fully dismantle. The workers' shares in the cooperative were non-transferable by design, a fundamental principle of the ownership model. The land and buildings were encumbered by the terms of the government loan. From the perspective of a conventional bank, there was nothing to seize if the cooperative defaulted, and therefore no basis on which to extend credit. Meriden was trading profitably and could not get a loan. Its competitors, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, were borrowing freely to fund the next generation of products that would define the 1980s market. The cooperative was running a sprint on a track that was, very slowly, being extended into a marathon. For now, though, the factory was busy, the order books were healthy, and John Rosamond had risen from his welding station to become, in 1977, the second and final chairman of the Workers' Board of Directors. A frame welder from Coventry, running a motorcycle company. It was the most unlikely management story in British industrial history, and for a few extraordinary years, it was working. The question was not whether the walls would close in. The question was when. The blow that ended Triumph Meriden did not come from Japan. It did not come from a faster motorcycle, a better engine, or a more competitive price. It came from the Treasury, delivered through the mechanism of monetary policy by a government that had not the slightest interest in whether the Bonneville lived or died. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in May 1979. Her administration's central economic priority was the defeat of inflation, and the instrument she chose was high interest rates. The policy worked in the narrow sense that inflation fell, but high interest rates attract foreign capital, and foreign capital drives up the value of the currency that earns it. Through 1979 and into 1980, the pound rose sharply against the dollar. By the time the exchange rate stabilized, £1 was buying $2.45. For a company that sold the majority of its motorcycles in America, priced in dollars, this was not an inconvenience. It was a structural catastrophe. A Triumph Bonneville that had been competitively priced in an American showroom in 1978 now cost 30 to 40% more in dollar terms without a single component having changed, without a single improvement having been made, without any decision by anyone at Meriden having contributed to the problem. The price increase was imposed from outside by forces entirely beyond the cooperative of control, and it landed at precisely the moment when Japanese manufacturers, pricing in yen, largely insulated from the same effect, were intensifying their assault on the middleweight market. American dealers who had been loyal to Triumph through the difficult years of the occupation and the cooperative's early struggles now faced an impossible commercial reality. They could not sell a Bonneville at the price the exchange rate demanded. Some reduced their orders. Some stopped ordering altogether. A few, facing the arithmetic squarely, began filling their showrooms with Hondas and Yamahas instead. The sales figures that had made 1978 such a moment of vindication collapsed through 1979 and into 1980 with a speed that left the cooperative's management struggling to respond. By 1980, Meriden carried a debt of £2 million, in addition to the original government loan of £4.2 million that had never been fully repaid. Geoffrey Robinson, the MP and businessman who had taken over as chief executive in 1978, had already been forced to deliver the news that redundancies were unavoidable. The workforce that had stood at over 600 in the cooperative's early years was contracting. The waiting list of 1,300 people wanting to work at Meriden had long since ceased to be relevant. The Thatcher government made its position clear without needing to state it explicitly. The era of government support for struggling manufacturers was over. The industrial policy that had kept British Leyland breathing, that had funded the NVT rescue, that had backed Tony Benn's cooperative experiment, was not simply being reconsidered, it was being dismantled as a matter of ideological principle. There would be no fresh loan for Meriden. There would be no exchange rate intervention. There would be no rescue. The cooperative responded the only way it knew how. It kept building motorcycles. The Silver Jubilee Bonneville had shown that limited editions could generate both revenue and publicity. The Royal Wedding Bonneville of 1981, 250 T140 LE models produced to mark the marriage of Charles and Diana, sold out before the ink was dry on the order forms. Each one became an immediate collector's piece, and the income, though modest in the context of the cooperative's debts, arrived at a moment when any income was welcome. More practically, Meriden's sales team worked international markets with a tenacity that belied the factory size. A large order for police motorcycles from Nigeria in 1979 arrived at a moment of genuine crisis and provided the cash flow that kept the cooperative operating through its most difficult year. A similar order from Ghana in 1982 performed the same function. These were not glamorous contracts. They were lifelines, seized by people who understood with absolute clarity that the alternative was closure. The product line expanded carefully within the limits of what the cooperative could afford to develop. The TR7T Tiger Trail, a dual-purpose machine aimed at the growing adventure riding market, added a second model alongside the Bonneville. The budget TR65 Thunderbird offered a lower entry price. A Tiger Trail won the Rallye des Pyrénées in 1981, providing the kind of competition-derived publicity that Triumph had always used to sell road bikes. And then, in 1982, the cooperative did something that surprised everyone who had written it off. They built the best motorcycle they had ever made. The T140W TSS Triumph Super Sports featured an 8-valve cylinder head designed in collaboration with Westlake Engineering, a revised crankshaft to reduce vibration, and a rubber-mounted engine that transformed the refinement of the parallel twin beyond anything its architecture had previously delivered. Period tests recorded a top speed of 125 miles per hour. Riders who had grown up with the Bonneville's characteristic buzz and shudder were astonished by how smooth it was. One American journalist, having spent a week with the TSS, wrote that it felt like a completely different motorcycle wearing a familiar face. 500 TSS models were planned for the American market in the 1982 to 1983 period. The exchange rate made the full number impossible to sell at a viable price. 112 were shipped. 112 motorcycles, the best thing Triumph Meriden ever built, and the market could absorb just 112 of them. The factory that had once produced 140 motorcycles a day was now, in its final months, building around 125 a week, assembled by just over 100 people in a building designed for nearly 20 times that number. The production lines that had once run continuous and loud were running in sections, with whole areas of the factory floor dark and silent. Machines that had not been started in months gathered dust beside stations where skilled workers still did. Every day, the jobs they had done for decades. The debt was £2 million and rising. The exchange rate showed no sign of moving. The government showed no sign of caring. John Rosamond chaired the board meetings. He had been a frame welder. He was now running a company through its final months, trying to find a combination of orders, loans, and product initiatives that might, somehow, against everything the numbers were saying, buy enough time for the exchange rate to shift, for a new model to find its market, for the TSS to demonstrate what it was capable of if given the chance. The TSS needed time. Meriden had run out of it. The official receiver was appointed in the summer of 1983. The paperwork that ended Triumph Motorcycles, Meriden Limited, as a legal entity, was processed in August, the same month, 38 years earlier, that the first workers had moved into the new factory on the edge of the village, full of post-war optimism and the particular pride of people building something from nothing. The symmetry was not lost on those who noticed it. It was that kind of story. In the weeks before the receiver arrived, the factory carried on. This was not denial. It was simply what the people of Meriden knew how to do. There were orders to fulfill, machines on the line at various stages of completion, components that had been paid for and needed to become motorcycles. The cooperative's final act, as a functioning business, was to finish what it had started. The line kept moving until there was nothing left to move. The factory in those last weeks bore almost no resemblance to the place it had been at its peak, where nearly 2,000 people had once filled every corner of the site with noise and motion, and the particular organized chaos of serious manufacturing. Just over 100 remained. Whole wings of the building had been dark for months. Production machinery that had run continuously through the 1960s stood idle, surfaces dulled by disuse. The car park, which had been full by 7 in the morning during the Bonneville's glory years, had gaps in it now that no one bothered to explain. But on the section of the line that was still running, the work was being done with the same care it had always been done with, perhaps more. The workers who remained knew they were building the last ones. There is a particular quality of attention that people bring to a final thing, a heightened awareness, a refusal to let standards slip, precisely because there will be no opportunity to make it right tomorrow. The last Bonnevilles to come off the Meriden line were, by all accounts, beautifully made. The 112 TSS models had already gone, boxed, shipped, and delivered to American dealers, who had ordered them months earlier, and was still waiting to see whether the 8-valve engine would do what Triumph claimed. It would. The riders who got those machines understood immediately that they were riding something exceptional. But the factory that had built them would not be there to build any more. The final days had a quality that everyone who was present struggled, later, to describe accurately. It was not dramatic in the way that the occupation of 1973 had been dramatic. There were no locked gates, no picket lines, no moment of confrontation that the television cameras could frame. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder. The occupation had been sustained by anger and solidarity and the forward momentum of a fight that had not yet been decided. The end of the cooperative had none of that energy. The fight was over. The result was known. What remained was simply the task of finishing, and then of leaving. John Rosamond was there for all of it. He had been a frame welder when Dennis Poor walked through the gates in September 1973. He had been on the occupation committee, at the negotiating table, in Tony Benn's office, in the boardroom. He had become chairman of the Workers' Board of Directors in 1977 and had held that position through every crisis since. The exchange rate collapse, the redundancies, the desperate police orders from Nigeria and Ghana, the development of the TSS that had arrived too late and in too small a number to save anything. He knew every person still working in that factory by name. He had welded frames alongside most of them. When the last motorcycle came off the line, there was no ceremony, no speeches, no photographs staged for the press, no final gathering in the canteen. The people of Meriden were not given to theatrical gestures, and in any case there was nothing theatrical about what was happening. They had fought as hard as it was possible to fight. They had built motorcycles that people wanted to buy. They had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable argument, that the workers of Meriden were capable of running their own factory. And they had been beaten in the end, not by anything they had done or failed to do, but by an exchange rate set in the treasury and a government that had decided their survival was not its problem. They turned off the machines. They hung up their overalls. They walked out of the gates, the same gates they had locked from the inside a decade earlier, in the conviction that if they simply refused to leave, something extraordinary might happen. Something extraordinary had happened. It just hadn't been enough. The official receiver moved through the building in the weeks that followed, cataloguing assets, valuing equipment, preparing for the disposal that would settle as much of the debt as possible. The tooling, the dies and jigs and fixtures that represented decades of accumulated manufacturing knowledge, was assessed and priced. Some of it would be acquired by Les Harris, a pattern spares manufacturer in Devon who had negotiated a licensing agreement with John Bloor, the man who had bought the Triumph name from the receiver. Under that arrangement, a small number of Bonnevilles would continue to be built in Devon through the mid-1980s, using predominantly Italian and German components. They were decent machines, loyally bought by people who could not yet bring themselves to let the name go, but they were not Meriden motorcycles, and everyone knew it. The factory itself was sold for development. A property company acquired the site and commissioned a housing estate, the kind of rent brick residential development that was spreading across the Midlands in the 1980s, as industrial land was released and repurposed. The buildings came down, the production lines were dismantled, the canteen where Tony Benn had stood before 400 cheering workers and announced the birth of the cooperative was rubble. Someone in the planning office, someone who understood what had happened on that particular piece of ground, or who had simply been asked by a resident who remembered, made sure the street names reflected what had been there before. Bonneville Close, Daytona Drive. The names of machines and places that had defined a factory and a community and an era preserved on blue signs in a quiet residential street where no motorcycle had been built for decades. It was a modest memorial. It was also, in its understated way, exactly right, the kind of acknowledgement that the people of Meriden would have chosen for themselves. Not a monument, not a museum, just the names, still there, in the place where it happened. John Rosamond found work at the new Triumph company in Hinckley, established by John Bloor after years of secret development. He stayed for a time, then returned to his original trade, assessing students in the craft of welding, until his retirement in 2003. He had spent 30 years in the motorcycle industry, 10 of them running a company that should not, by any conventional measure, have existed at all. He had been a welder, he had become a chairman. He had built, with 600 other people, something that the financial system said was impossible, and the motorcycle market said was wanted. That, in the end, is what Meriden was. Not a failure, a proof. A proof that the workers were right about what they could do, delivered in full, in the time they were given, against forces that were always going to be too large to fight with motorcycles alone. The 100 and more people who walked out of Meriden in August 1983 did so into a West Midlands that was not the same place it had been when the occupation began a decade earlier. The Britain of 1973 had been a country of full employment, of powerful trade unions, of a political consensus that held, however imperfectly, that the state had a responsibility to sustain the communities built around its major industries. The Britain of 1983 was something different. Unemployment had passed 3 million. The miners' strike was approaching. The industrial settlements of the Midlands and the North were being asked to adapt to an economy that no longer had much use for the skills they had spent generations developing. For the workers of Meriden, the timing could not have been worse. There was no substantial retraining program waiting for them. No government agency had been tasked with managing the transition of a skilled motorcycle manufacturing workforce into alternative employment. The redundancy payments that the receiver could distribute were modest, constrained by the cooperative's debt position and the limited value of assets that had already been heavily depreciated. A frame welder from Coventry in August 1983 was a skilled person in a region that was rapidly running out of uses for the particular skills he possessed. Some found work in the car industry. Rover, Jaguar, and the suppliers that served them were still operating within reach, though they too were under pressure. Some moved into general engineering. Some did not find equivalent work again. The community of practice that had assembled at Meriden over 4 decades, the accumulated knowledge of how to build a Triumph Bonneville, held not in any document or manual, but in the hands and minds of the people who had done it, dispersed into the wider Midlands and was not reassembled. This is the loss that statistics do not capture. The redundancy figures, the unemployment numbers, the debt totals, these can be recorded and cited. What cannot be easily quantified is the dissolution of a manufacturing culture, the particular combination of skill, identity, and collective knowledge that makes a factory more than the sum of its equipment. Meriden had that culture in abundance. It had been built over decades, reinforced by the unusual solidarity of the occupation years, and expressed daily in the quality of the motorcycles that came off the line. When the factory closed, that culture closed with it. The question that academics and historians have argued over ever since is whether the closure was inevitable, whether the cooperative, given its structural constraints, was always going to end this way, or whether different decisions at critical moments might have produced a different outcome. The structural case for inevitability is not without force. The cooperative was capitalized on terms that no conventional business would have accepted. A large loan, a modest grant, no access to further credit, and no ownership of the distribution infrastructure that connected it to its most important market. It was asked to compete against manufacturers with vastly greater resources, on a basis that gave it no margin for the kind of external shocks, an exchange rate movement, a recession, a delayed product launch, that any business operating over a decade will inevitably encounter. The cards were not stacked in its favor from the beginning, and the people who dealt them knew it. But the case for contingency, for the view that things could have been otherwise, is also serious. The cooperative was profitable in its middle years. The Bonneville was commercially viable as recently as 1978. The TSS, given time and volume, might genuinely have extended the product's competitive life into the mid-1980s. A modest adjustment to the exchange rate or a bridging loan of the kind that was routinely extended to far less viable enterprises in other sectors might have been enough. The margin between survival and failure in the cooperative's final months was not large. What is not in serious dispute is the role of the Thatcher government's economic policy in delivering the killing blow. The exchange rate that destroyed Triumph's American pricing was not a market outcome in any neutral sense. It was the direct consequence of specific policy choices made by a government that understood their sectoral effects and regarded those effects as an acceptable cost of controlling inflation. Other governments, at other times, have managed exchange rate policy with more attention to the industrial consequences. This one did not. Whether that was negligence or indifference or simply the ruthless application of a coherent economic philosophy is a question each observer will answer according to their own politics. What is harder to dispute is the human arithmetic. A community that had organized itself with remarkable sophistication, had demonstrated genuine commercial competence, and had produced motorcycles of exceptional quality, was destroyed not by its own failures, but by forces it could not control, and decisions it was not consulted about. The workers of Meriden did not fail the cooperative was failed. By undercapitalization at its birth, by the loss of distribution control in its settlement, and by an exchange rate movement in its final years that it had no means of absorbing. They deserved better than they got. That is not a sentimental judgment. It is the conclusion that a clear-eyed examination of the evidence supports. And yet the story does not end in August 1983 with a locked gate and a receiver's inventory. It ends, or rather, it continues, in the way that the best industrial stories always do, with the stubborn persistence of something that was supposed to have been finished. The Bonneville Close sign went up in the housing estate that replaced the factory. Daytona Drive followed it. Someone remembered, someone always remembers. 30 miles away, in a converted industrial unit in Hinckley, Leicestershire, a man named John Bloor was doing something that no one outside a small circle of engineers and lawyers knew about yet. He had bought the Triumph name from the receiver. He was building something new. The name had survived. That meant the story had survived. And a story that survives is not the story that is finished.
John Bloor was not by background a motorcycle man. He had started his working life as a plasterer, built a construction business through the 1960s and 1970s, and accumulated the kind of wealth that allowed him by the early 1980s to move into property development on a significant scale. When the Triumph receiver offered the Meriden site for redevelopment, Bloor was a natural buyer. He intended to flatten the factory and build houses. The numbers made sense. The decision was straightforward. Then, he looked at the paperwork more carefully and saw what else was being sold alongside the land. The Triumph name, the engineering drawings, the accumulated intellectual property of 80 years of motorcycle manufacturing. The receiver was offering it all as a package, and the asking price, in the context of what Bloor was already spending on the site, was modest. He bought it.
Not because he had a plan for it, not immediately, but because he understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent his career identifying undervalued assets, that a name with that much history attached to it was worth more than the receiver's valuation suggested. What Bloor did next was extraordinary in its patience and its secrecy. He did not announce a Triumph revival. He did not hold a press conference. He did not invite the motorcycle press to inspect his plans. He quietly hired a team of engineers, some of them veterans of the British motorcycle industry, others drawn from automotive backgrounds, and he set them to work in a facility that the outside world knew almost nothing about. For 7 years, Triumph Motorcycles Limited existed as a legal entity with no public presence, developing an entirely new range of motorcycles from a blank sheet. This was not restoration. Bloor was not interested in resuming production of the air-cooled parallel twin that had defined Triumph for 30 years. He understood that the market of the 1990s would not be the market of the 1960s, and that a motorcycle company attempting to compete on the basis of nostalgia alone was a motorcycle company with a limited future. What he wanted was a range of modern, water-cooled, multi-cylinder machines that could compete directly with the best that Japan and Europe were producing. Machines that carried the Triumph name not as an apology for their modernity, but as a statement of confidence in it. The new factory rose in Hinckley, Leicestershire, through the late 1980s. It was equipped with modern production technology, computer-controlled machining centres, and quality control systems that the Meriden cooperative could only have dreamed of affording. When the first new Triumphs emerged in 1990 and 1991, a range of 3- and 4-cylinder liquid-cooled machines in 3, 4, and 600 cubic centimeter configurations, the motorcycle press, which had been skeptical to the point of cynicism about whether Blue's project would ever produce a rideable result, was comprehensively silenced. The bikes were good, not promising, not adequate, not a creditable first effort from a revived British manufacturer. Good, genuinely, objectively, competitively good. They handled well, they were reliable. They were finished to a standard that matched anything coming out of Japan at the same price point. Within a few years, Triumph Motorcycles was a credible player in the global middleweight and heavyweight market. Within a decade, it was among the most respected motorcycle manufacturers in the world. In 2001, the Bonneville came back. The new T100 was not the machine that John Rosamond had welded frames for in Meriden. It shared a name, a silhouette, and a design language with the original, but beneath the classic styling was a completely new parallel twin engine, water-cooled and fuel-injected, built to modern emissions standards and capable of running indefinitely without the mechanical attention that the original Bonneville had required of its owners. It was, in every technical sense, a different motorcycle. And yet, it was unmistakably a Bonneville. The proportions were right. The sound was right. Not identical to the original, but related to it. A family resemblance rendered in exhaust notes and engine character, rather than in displacement and valve timing. Riders who had grown up with the original recognized something in the new machine that went beyond the badge on the tank. It carried the memory of the thing it had been named after, and it carried it honestly. The market responded with an enthusiasm that justified every year of Blau's patient development. The Bonneville became Triumph's most important model, not its most profitable, not its most technologically advanced, but the one that anchored the brand's identity and drew riders into the showroom, who then discovered the Speed Triple, the Tiger, the Daytona. It was the name that opened the door, and it opened it in markets that the original Triumph had never reached. Triumph Motorcycles today sells tens of thousands of motorcycles annually across more than 60 countries. It is the largest British-owned motorcycle manufacturer in the world. None of that exists without Meriden, not without the factory itself. Hinckley is no continuation of Meriden, and Blau's Triumph is not the cooperative's Triumph. But without the name that the Meriden workers fought to keep alive, without the decade of production that prevented the Triumph Bonneville from becoming merely a historical footnote, without the stubbornness of 600 people who refused to accept that the accountants were right, the name that Blau bought from the receiver would have been worth considerably less, perhaps nothing at all. The workers of Meriden did not save Triumph Motorcycles. What they did was more specific, and in some ways more remarkable. They kept the name alive and credible in the market, long enough for someone with the resources to do what they could not to come along and use it. They were the bridge between the company that Dennis Poor tried to close in September 1973 and the company that John Blau opened in Hinckley in 1990. Without the bridge, there is no crossing. Bonneville Close still runs through the housing estate that replaced the factory. The sign is blue and white, like every other street sign in the village, and it says nothing about what the name means or where it came from. Residents who have moved in over the decades may not know that the street they live on is named for a motorcycle, or that the motorcycle was built on the ground beneath their homes, or that the people who built it once locked the gates of their factory from the inside and refused to leave for 18 months because they believed that what they were doing mattered. It mattered. It still does. On 14 September 1973, Dennis Poor read a statement, declined to answer questions, and drove back to London, certain that he had closed a factory. He had closed a factory.
But the name he thought he was extinguishing, the name that had ridden across the Bonneville salt flats at 214 miles per hour, that had starred in Hollywood, that had won at the Isle of Man and conquered the American market and been welded together one frame at a time by men and women who gave the best years of their working lives to a building on the edge of a Warwickshire village. That name did not go with him. It stayed. It is still here. And somewhere in Hinckley right now, a Bonneville is coming off the line.